Hello, sir.
Well, hello.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I've been doing great. It's been a little bit.
I know. I'm grinning because this started out just like an Art of Product episode
It did, yes.
of old,
Of your.
of yore.
How many have we done? We must have done a couple hundred AOPs, right?
I'm pretty sure we crossed 200, but I don't have the exact number in my head.
Yeah. So that's a lot of weeks. One a week for
Weeks.
years and years.
Yeah.
But so for some people might not know you. We haven't done AOP in a little while. So you were my co-host on this podcast for a long time, where you and I would talk about building our businesses. A couple businesses actually appeared on that podcast over the years. We went through some transitions, but you are a ridiculous human in some senses, in that you are a very strong programmer and a really good designer and a good product person. So you have quite the collection of skills.
Well, thank you for saying that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And that's not just for the podcast. I think that. So you were the co-founder of Drip, along with Rob Walling, that people might know. You are now the founder of SavvyCal, which is a really excellent find time on my calendar tool. Like cranked up to 11. I feel like you are the tuple of scheduling, where it's like, what if you just tried to make this, but really, really good and really sweated all the details?
Yeah.
It's like we have a team account. We use it internally. We use it externally. I book a lot of personal things through it. And it just is a really pleasant way to send excellent sort of scheduling links to folks.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the high praise.
Yeah. So props on all that. So we figured we would chat kind of, for old time's sake. I saw you a couple days ago. It was fun to see you. Unlike AOP, which was a bit more sort of day-to-day business focused, this is a bit more code focused. So we'll get a little bit into some technical topics.
Cool.
But
I like to get nerdy.
yeah, great. But maybe slightly on the business side. It seems like you are shipping features for sales teams recently. Is this a segment that you are going after?
It's a good question. I think SavvyCal it's been a tricky road because it's inherently a very horizontal product, right? So probably a lot of people are familiar with Calendly if you haven't heard of SavvyCal. And we have chosen a pretty similar type of positioning in the market where it's theoretically anybody could use it. Now, obviously we kind of try to attract, people who have certain sensibilities and care about quality, to be honest, and so it narrows it a little bit, but it's still, generally speaking, pretty broad. And yeah, one of the experiments of late has been, should we try, without totally making the product not something that your general, entrepreneur or business person would like, can we potentially narrow it just a touch on where we focus to try to hit some pockets of the market that maybe we're not resonating with a ton right now, and unlock some more growth, which is very difficult for a horizontal product, I think, or probably any product, to be honest. But especially horizontal, where we haven't been able to have a leading headline on our marketing site that's like, we are scheduling for sales teams. Instead, it's like, we are a delightful way to find a time to meet, or a thoughtful way, or whatever. So yeah, that's been one of the experiments. It's had middling success, I would say, but definitely instinctually as a founder, I always feel like the closer you can get a product to the revenue in a business, the better position you're in. Customers are hopefully likely to value it more if you're helping drive revenue.
Totally. It seems like sales teams pay for software. They're down to buy stuff that helps them.
Yeah, totally.
Interesting. So, do you want to serve that market?
Well, that's the thing. Do I want to? I think it's...
Don't worry, they're not listening. No one.
Yeah. They don't listen to these nerd podcasts. I think it's always tricky too. You can think in verticals, right? Sales teams or customer success teams or marketing teams or whatever. And then you can also kind of slice it in a different direction, and you can think about small teams, mid-size, enterprise, large company. There's all those different bucketings, and they're sort of imprecise. And oftentimes we don't even know what we mean when we say small business or mid-size, but think of like the types of customers that Basecamp serves or that MailChimp serves or Calendly. Like these companies generally, I feel like started with their bread and butter as, solopreneurs or small teams that care about higher quality products and not necessarily trying to appeal to, larger companies where the buying process is just different. Like there's a finance team and there's procurement and there's, oftentimes the people charged with buying products are not the same people who are using them. So there's a lot of kind of different dynamics to tap into. And then often you're looking at higher price points and doing higher touch sales. And so I feel like that's been the bigger thing for me to try to figure out, is like, I feel like that's the whole game here, this being a founder, is like figuring out really what game you want to play. And and I think I still haven't totally figured it out with certainty, because part of it's like, I also want to grow my business, so I want to go where the growth's going to be, but how many of my ideals can I hold on to at the same time? And I know I have a natural bias towards serving the small, small businesses like myself, but then it's like, are you holding yourself back? So I think those are the types of things that run through my brain when I think about that.
Yeah, that's tough. So I'm getting a sense that like maybe this particular segment doesn't like, you're not like drawn towards it necessarily spiritually. You're not like dying to do that, but also you have this broader goal of want number go up,
right? Right.
Have successful business, that kind of thing. That maybe you're willing to sacrifice some of that, perhaps.
Yeah.
Sort of like trade things off against each other. Mm-hmm. It does feel like, man, you can of course go back and forth on this all the time, but like having a landing page where it's like this tool for these people used in this way, and the right person finds it and they go, oh, perfect. Yes, this is what I want. And as like a product designer, thinking about a narrow niche probably just simplifies the world so much versus, who could be using this? Coaches, therapists, whatever. Ben makes it harder. And I think you've nailed I feel like you have really nailed the general case of just like, this is a really good scheduling tool. It can handle a ton of different circumstances. So I wonder how much more room there is to run on that front versus being like, all right, we're going to choose a lane and now we can really go specialized on something.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's tough. I mean, I think I could probably rant about some of this stuff more broadly, just how like, okay, a lot of us kind of got our start looking at companies like 37 Signals, right? Who were sort of projecting this vision into the world of basically kind of early stage how SaaS works, as a business model. And it's like, it's this beautiful thing where you get to charge on a recurring basis, and you can serve what I think Jason Fried calls it, like the Fortune 5 million. You can serve, the masses of businesses out there who are willing to pay a little bit of money each month for products, and you can be a craftsperson and you can build a really high quality product, and you can, obviously there's a big element there of like getting massive distribution or enough to be able to build a meaningful growing business that scales. But so that's sort of an important detail that often gets kind of forgotten. Like you need that element, but like so many other parts about their ethos, I feel like so many of us latched onto, and now it's tough as like someone who identifies very much as like predominantly a craftsperson. Like I love building product, and I like to think that the special stuff I bring to the table and putting stuff into the market is like that it is higher quality and better. And it's tough because I think a lot of like indie SaaS makers and bootstrappers and whatever you want to call us, a lot of us have like switched over to figuring out that like that's a really hard road, and there's not many marketing channels and distribution channels compared to businesses where there's a higher price point, where maybe it's more niche, maybe it's doing higher touch sales, and you're figuring out how to sell to larger companies, and more power to anyone that goes that route. But like I'm like, I wonder if there's am I one of the last of my kind trying to like replicate the dream that we all kind of got inspired by early on, you know?
Yeah, we arguably kind of have a similar problem in that our customer feels fairly clear to me. Like it's developers who are already convinced of the value of like synchronous collaboration. But is a good customer for us a company with two programmers? Sure. Yeah, that's totally fine. How about 3,000? Sure. Yeah. Okay. Just make sure to design for both those cases and everything will be fine.
Right.
And it's like, ooh, actually that's kind of hard sometimes.
Yeah.
So there's always the like, ooh, what about Shopify? It's sort of how it comes up for us a lot of the time when we're thinking of features. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to think like how badly do you want it? Are you willing, like, are you going to go to salesperson conferences? You know,
Yeah.
you know, like, and like, it doesn't have to be you, but is your company?
Yeah. Yeah. And if that's an important way to really get into that market, then it's sort of like, well, do I really want to do that? And it does often feel like the decision between like sometimes these dichotomies emerge, and I have to try to figure out if they're false, you know, like these, it's like, well, do you want to raise your prices and sell to enterprise, or are you happy just staying a little lifestyle business? And I'm like, how about neither? You know, I would like to grow. Obviously, I would like to, to build even more flywheels to drive more growth, because I'm ambitious. Don't get me wrong. I want my business to be as successful as possible. But can I do that without doing the enterprise sales thing? I wonder.
Yeah.
You know,
man, I was having these thoughts. So we were at MicroConf this last week, which was, great to see everybody. I had a nice time. But I found myself thinking, especially as I'm watching some of the talks, like where people are giving this like growth advice, like here's how you grow a company. And the thought was occurring to me, like I don't think there are any reliable answers to like make a company grow. And if you were in possession of a reliable answer to that, it is not, I don't know, like the sign of that would not be like you were on stage giving a talk about it to me. It would be you were becoming fantastically successful and wealthy, growing a company.
Yeah.
So yeah, even the idea of like, oh, well, like we'll just go enterprise and then we'll start growing. Maybe. It's like there's so much. I feel like there's like a little bit of alchemy here, where there's so many factors and variables and timing and all this. That's like almost all of the recipes to me are like maybe that'll work. Perhaps like test it out, try it, decide. I don't know, but I suspect there's not that much alpha in like the things that everyone is sort of talking and thinking about and sharing as like the classic growth tips.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, and I think probably the one thing that sticks with me the most about this, because I think it's not fair to say that one path is necessarily easier than the other, because I think none of it's easy, you know. But I do think, the way basically if you charge a low price point and you have a pretty low ceiling on the amount that someone can pay you, or the amount that the markets you're serving typically does pay you, then you just have a lot fewer options for going to market. Like you have to be, I guess, really good at SEO, really good at content, or some of these like extremely scalable, low cost channels. And so like, I think of like the Traction book from Gabriel Weinberg, and there's like 20 something in there, and probably just a handful actually scale down to the price point that I'm at. And so then you look at the companies that manage to break out and do really, really well. It was cool. Ben Chestnut from MailChimp, co-founder of MailChimp, was at MicroConf this year and did a little fireside chat. But I think they're an example of, they were in the market at the right time, and they did percolate for a while before actually like turning all their focus onto the product. So I think they were able to sort of wait things out, and they got a little lucky in the fact that like they were kind of the best option for people who cared about quality, and they just hit it at the right time, I suppose, and were really good at doing what they do. And so then they got a foothold in that space as like the the low cost / freemium, email service provider that creative people really like. And there was enough untapped demand that they were able to scale into that. Whereas it would probably be hard to like do MailChimp all over again with the same exact pricing scheme,
I think that's always true.
Yeah. There are these moments where like these things just work and then they don't work. And one could probably argue that if you have a more, a higher price point product, then you just have a lot more potential avenues to go to market through, or potential avenues for distribution than if you're just trying to like hit a massive wave of relatively low price point folks.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your stack a little bit.
Yeah. You can tell, I'm coming out digesting a lot of businessy things coming off of MicroConf.
Oh, I can't. Yeah, I mean, it's my sweet spot too, so I have to like drag myself a little bit. So SavvyCal is an Elixir app.
It is.
And so I think it's been enough years that you actually have some like, you can tell how it's gone, because I think like evaluating a technical choice and architectural choice, even in the first year or two, is kind of like, yeah, of course it's working well. Of course it's fast to add new things, and there's not that much mass there yet. But like, you're definitely far enough along and the product is mature enough that there's substantially more functionality, complexity, I'm sure. You've probably done some substantial refactors and you've seen what it's like to add new things now. So I'm curious how you feel like that has gone for you.
Yeah, I will say that is definitely a choice that I don't regret. Elixir has been fantastic. And I feel like Phoenix is, this was my hypothesis early on, that Phoenix, which is kind of the equivalent to Rails, but in the Elixir ecosystem, really is, to me, feels like the best parts of Rails. Like the parts of Rails that I really came to love and continued to love over time, I feel like made their way into Phoenix. And then a lot of the parts where I sort of grew a little bit weary, particularly the more magical elements of Rails, where like stuff is less explicit, I guess. And like, I don't know, feels like, magic's probably the right way to use it. Like, it's just a little bit harder to follow, a little bit more indirection, whatever. And some may call that like really well factored code, but to me, like a lot of that stuff just, it became more difficult to maintain as team size grew. I felt like at Drip, having maintained like a really large Rails application for 8 years, So I feel like Phoenix is kind of the best of both worlds.
Wow.
Just in terms of maintainability and really kind of thoughtful architecture. Yeah.
What stands out there for you? Because you sort of said like explicitness, it seems like is a thing. Like there's less magic reflection to sort of determine the name of the whatever.
Yeah.
Why does it feel better to you?
I mean, I think pretty much everything that the framework provides, you can easily hop to with like one step of indirection. So like, if you're in a controller and you want to know like what's going on inside of that controller, like there's a thing that you use. It's like a kind of a fancy import that like imports some functionality into your controller that the framework provides. But like being able to inspect what those things are is very easy to do. So like I'm relying a lot less on the documentation to try to like unravel where the convention over configuration stuff is coming from. It's kind of just right there at the ready for you to look at. And I just feel like in general, there's a lot more. I think the functional paradigm lends itself really well to this, where, ultimately it's just functions inside of modules and you're passing data around, and there's a little bit to get used to. And making method calls on objects in Ruby, I will admit, feels nice, but I think again, it often, when you have this really long method chain that reads like a sentence that DHH loves, to me, like that often ends up being worse for trying to maintain. So like the fact that you just take your data and you pass it around between functions, and sometimes you decide your functions aren't organized properly and you move them into a different module, but that's really the extent of it.
Right.
I really enjoy that.
Yeah. Unlike like moving a method off an object onto another one, where suddenly that method has access to different local data.
Yeah.
The functions are just taking their data. They're just having it passed in. And so you don't really care where they live, actually.
Yeah, and I remember with Rails, like I think we spent a lot of time, me individually early on, and then as a team collectively trying to figure out where to put stuff. Like should we create these service objects that kind of tie together multiple objects, or should everything be moved into a concern that we mix into our objects? And I just feel like a lot of effort was spent in that area, and still like the kind of the Rails conventional way of doing things. I think we found ourselves ditching some of that in the name of explicitness, but then we were kind of felt like we were a little bit off on our own island, like doing things not quite the Rails way. So we sort of had made up a way, which felt worse, because then it felt like we sort of abandoned some of the benefits of conventional or configuration, or just doing things the way the framework wants it done, so that if you were to expand the team and bring on more Rails developers, they would just kind of immediately know, where to find stuff. It's like, felt like we had sort of abandoned the path at a certain point.
Ooh.
And I don't think the same thing's happening in my Elixir code base, because I think there are some loose paths for sure. Like there's some using bounded contexts is sort of a concept that Phoenix brings in as like an opinion on a way you should sort of organize your code. And we basically follow that. But aside from that, there's not a lot from what I've seen of these like conventions that everyone expects you to be following, or that the framework really wants you to adhere to. And I think that's for the better.
Interesting. I'm sort of surprised, because I do feel like the conventions in Rails are pretty darn handy.
I think a lot of them are, for sure. But I think, the whole debate around fat model, skinny controller, and then like models get too fat, and then where are you going to put the stuff in the models? Like I just kind of remembered that, that became, it's like when stuff gets sufficiently large, then the conventions kind of start bursting at the seams a little bit.
It's funny because to me, this all just feels like it falls out of like object-oriented versus functional programming.
Yeah.
Where like, and I think I think there's a Steve Yegge piece called like Verbs in the Kingdom of Nouns, which I think we wrote about Java, but it's the idea applies, I believe, which is, to dramatically paraphrase based on a fuzzy memory of a piece I may be misquoting, it's just like in OO, every time you want to do something, you have to like a verb. Every time you want to add a method, it has to be attached to a noun. It has to be live in an object. And so it's like just every time you and programs are fundamentally just doing stuff, right? They are verbing. They're not nouning. They are like taking some data, doing some data, returning some data, like doing something to it in between. But if you need to find a noun to attach every single verb to, you end up in this weird, like, is it a service object that has like a one method called run? Is it on the user object? Or like, is it on the user model? Because a lot of the data is on the user model, so it should live there. Well, it's already pretty big there, so maybe it should do that. It should delegate somewhere else. I think a lot of that just disappears when you're like, it's fine. It's just a function and it takes data, and it doesn't really matter where it is exactly. Their modules are cool, but they're mostly just a namespace. I think I've just been like pretty thoroughly like functional programming pilled. And like, I'm not even sure this is Rails versus Phoenix so much as just like, what do you do when you are in an object-oriented paradigm versus a functional one?
Mm-hmm. And I will say, like, because I was very curious when 37 Signals released Campfire, their once product. I did actually buy a copy of it because I just wanted to see like, how do they architect code these days? And I think a lot of people bought it for that reason, to kind of see, see how the people kind of the driving force behind Rails, how are they architecting code bases? And then DHH did a live stream for like an hour and just like walked through the code base. And it was pretty fascinating because I think it looks very, very clean, and stuff is all kind of spread out across, concerns. And so models seem very short, even though they're doing a lot. And I think to a lot of people that feels like a win. That feels really good. And to me, as I watched him kind of walk through, like, oh, this stuff is kind of not entirely core to this, and I want to be able to look in the file and just see the stuff that's very specific to this object. So we're going to move all this stuff into a concern. And maybe that concern will be shared between multiple objects, but none of that is really evident unless you do a lot of string searching and try to see like where are all the places where this concern might be mixed into other models. And at a certain point, after just kind of digesting this way of doing things, I just felt like, to me, this doesn't feel more explicit. It doesn't feel cleaner, even though it looks cleaner on the surface. Yep.
I think people tend to slightly overweight the value of it looks tidy and clean.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I've tucked all of these methods somewhere. It's not on my screen. So when I look at this object, it looks like it's short. There's only like 10, 20 lines. Yes, 8 of them are includes that mix in a total of like 50 methods. And also I'm inheriting from active record or active model or whatever it is these days. And so now there's another 5,000 methods on this model. Yep. But it looks nice and tidy, so everything's cool. And it's like, well, is that true? Or are, in fact, you just passing this massive monstrosity around this giant noun with so many verbs attached? And every time you want to do something, you have to like get a handle on one of those. I understand the aesthetic appeal, and I feel that motivation too.
Yeah.
But yeah, have you actually, if you're just pushing the peas around the plate, it seems like.
Yeah. That's a good analogy. And like, I remember being so obsessed in the early days of being a Rails programmer on like having a 1 or 2 line long method only, like method length was such an emphasis. And I get it because you don't want to, you still, I'm not saying you shouldn't think about organizing your code well, but I just remember coming over into the functional paradigm, there was a lot more, I guess, acceptance of just, keeping logic that should be co-located together, keeping it in one place, even if that means you have a long function, and I just found a lot more acceptance of that. And it kind of felt like, finally, I don't feel like I'm necessarily a bad programmer in this ecosystem if I allow something to get a little long, Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, that feels right. We age and we learn, we get a little more wise, hopefully. A few more years, they'll have a whole different set of opinions. Fingers crossed.
Another thing I'll point out from the Elixir ecosystem that's been really nice. So they have an ORM, for interfacing with your database, but it follows the repository pattern instead of the acrid record pattern. And I'm not an expert on these patterns, but I think the repository pattern lends itself well to functional, I think, because you sort of have this repository module that has functions like insert and get, and then you have queries that are a separate thing. And I know you can do some of this in active record, like you can use AREL or whatever they call it, and you can construct queries and pass them over. But generally speaking, like query formation in active record happens kind of through the objects instead of through a separate query mechanism. And like a lot of associations get kind of auto loaded in active record, which is, a big source of n+1 queries and stuff. And the ORM in Elixir called Ecto basically does none of that. Like it doesn't auto preload anything for you. So preloads are all explicit. And so it's been really nice to have kind of both explicit preloading and separation of queries from actual operations. And then kind of in between, sitting in between there, like a raw query for getting stuff. There's this concept of change sets where you can say, pass a struct in and then say, I want to modify these few fields. And then that can sit in a change set and you can keep passing that around and making layering on additional changes and validations. And then you pass that change set to the repo for persistence. And then it does the persistence to the database. So it's a really nice pattern. It takes a little getting used to, but like everything in moving from OO to functional, but I have found it quite delightful and like basically eliminated a lot of the sneaky n+1 queries that would sneak into the code base.
Interesting. I don't feel like I have a good picture of the like active record versus repository patterns. Do you feel like you have enough to like take a crack at that?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I probably wouldn't do it proper treatment of like the actual, Martin Fowler patterns or whatever.
Okay. What about the concretions in Rails and Phoenix? Like,
Yeah. Okay.
as you use them.
So in Rails, right, if you want to fetch a user, you call user.get, right? And you maybe pass in an ID,
user.find or something.
Or find, user.find one, and then you get back a user. And then if you want to make changes to that user, then what you would like set a different property on there and then call save, and Active Record would just sort of magically figure out what changed since you last loaded it, and then make the necessary updates to the database.
Yep.
And I think when, like, say you want to get a list of users, it would be like user.list. Is that
user.all?
User.all. You can see all of my Rails naming conventions have slowly fallen out of my brain.
Yep.
So you call user.all, and then say user has, many scheduling links. Okay. Then you have an association on that, and remind me, how did those associations get loaded? Are they usually kind of auto-loaded in Rails land?
No, I think if you just said, user.all, it would not load the associated things. But if
you called like user.links, if you had a links association on the user, then it would kind of magically call that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll kind of use that similar example for fetching a list of users and their links in Ecto land. So you might call repo.all and the user module. So it knows user module corresponds to a schema type. So repo.all, and then you fetch all the users. There is no method on that. A user is just a data structure, right? So you can't just call user.links. User does have a links property on it, but it defaults to being set as a ecto not loaded data structure. So like if you tried to use that, it's like a kind of a null state. And in order to fetch that, you have to explicitly call repo.preload, pass in the user struct and the name of the association that you want to preload in order to fetch it. And if you do that with a collection of users, so if you say repo.preload and you give it a list of users and say, I want the links for all those users, then Ecto will figure out how to most efficiently fetch all of the links for all of the users you gave it. So it basically prevents you from being able to accidentally, inside of a loop, call, give me the links for each of these users. And then you do that in a really inefficient way.
Got it. So it's like rare. It's like pretty much, it's not making automatic additional database queries for you. You have to consciously decide to do that.
Yes. Yep.
And then is persisting stuff different?
Yeah. So persisting stuff, like if I have a user and I want to, say, change their name, then I call. So there's another data structure called a change set, and you basically build these change sets, and they represent modifications to an existing data structure. So you pass it in, and you say, I want to allow a certain number of certain attributes to be changed. So say they're coming in from a controller action or something, and you want to allow first and last name to be changed on a user.
Yeah.
So you can say, take this user, and you want to cast the user and this user supplied data that came from a controller. And you say, I want to accept first name and last name. So then with that cast function, it basically builds a change set that represents kind of modifications to those two properties. And then that change set, you can also add validation. So if you have a length validation on name or whatever, and it knows at any given state, whether it's in an invalid state or valid. And then when you're ready to persist those changes, you pass the change set into a repo.update function. And then that applies the actual changes to the database.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you manipulate the change sets directly sometimes? Like programmatically, is that a useful thing to be able to have like this thing that represents the change that's happening and you can like do stuff with it and to it or ask it things?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in Rails, we often would try to we'd sometimes build these like form objects that sort of like represented an abstract set of changes,
Right. Yeah.
And that's basically what a change set is. So
Yeah.
sometimes I build them just to represent a collection of changes that ultimately affect, several different database tables. So like if I'm a classic example for us in SavvyCal, when a user signs up, they give us name, first name, last name, and then the URL for their like kind of personal scope in SavvyCal. So like this kind of registration form has fields that ultimately live on multiple database tables. There's like a users table and a scopes table, and they're kind of related to each other. So I have this change set that's sort of it's an abstract change set. It doesn't actually map directly to a database table.
Yep.
And I can take that user supplied input, run validations on it, and if it is deemed valid, then I can pass what is already pre-validated data into change sets for each of those tables and persist those changes.
Interesting. Cool. Yes, right when form objects were becoming quite popular is about when I bailed out of the Rails world.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's freshest in my mind.
Yeah.
So let's talk about open source for a minute. You have open sourced some pieces of the SavvyCal code base over the years, and you were tweeting recently that you're thinking about open sourcing the Open Graph image generation service.
Yeah.
Which would be cool. How do you think about when to do that versus not? Like you don't primarily, I think, sell to developers, so it's maybe the case is a bit weaker or different than usual.
Yeah.
For some companies, for like us, for example.
Yep. It's a good question. I think I see open source contributions as really just like a good faith contribution to the commons. I mean, we benefit so much from open source software. Like almost the entirety of SavvyCal is built on open source software. So I think those, the little packages we have, let's see, we have one for kind of our time zone logic. We've just like done a bunch of work cobbling together time zone data from different packages and sort of have like a unified way to bundle all that up. And it kind of felt like this feels library-ish, and we already basically did all the work for this in our application already. It's like relatively easy to just peel that away and release it as a separate package. So I think a lot of the stuff we release is like, it's not a ton of effort to do it, and it might benefit someone else. And it's just generally kind of a nice thing to do to contribute something back. The Open Graph service, I feel like that's in that vein as well, and also like kind of another opportunity just to like, get some attention from the community. I mean, there's a marketing angle to it as well. Even though we don't primarily market to developers, I think we market to a lot of founders, and a lot of founders are, it's particularly in the tech space, and that could be something that founders would appreciate. And so there could be a little bit of marketing there. But I mean, again, it's not like we wouldn't pin a whole lot on that. I don't necessarily have high expectations that it'll be a huge, source of growth for us or anything. It's just one more little thing to do.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I loved your first answer of just like, it's a good faith contribution to the commons. Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm convinced.
Yep.
I want to live in a world where people think that way and do that.
Yeah. Because I'm amazed when I look at some of the projects that we rely on that are large in scale, but they're not so large that someone can be like full-time employed to work on that thing. I'm just blown away that people are willing to spend their nights and weekends and maybe a little bit of time on the clock, but for the most part, their own free time, just like maintaining these open source projects for sort of an indefinite period of time. I mean, it blows my mind. And I feel like I'm pretty selfish compared to that. Like I'm mostly just taking the open source projects and building stuff on them. So I don't know. It's my little contribution I can make.
Yeah, it does feel, it's kind of crazy. Like I don't think this is like a thing you would have predicted if you'd known the things going into the ingredients. It feels almost like a little bit of magic happened, and we shouldn't like look at it too closely, or think about it too hard or ask too many questions because like something amazing happened and it keeps working and that's great. Just be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess, and I don't really know what are the incentives for someone who spends, many, many, many hours a week maintaining a project for no monetary reward? Like, what's in it for them, And maybe it's just, I don't know. Do you have a hypothesis on that? Like, what is in it for them?
I think there actually is some status to be had there.
Yeah.
Like if you are the creator of a popular open source thing, that's cred.
Some cred.
You were cooler than someone who doesn't do that in the circles that you probably care about.
Yeah.
You're going to get invited to give conference talks that you wouldn't otherwise. Your coworkers might think you're more impressive otherwise.
Yep.
So I think there's some of that. But I think there's also there's probably a reasonably strong altruistic motivation. Like you just actually do want to be it feels nice to be useful. Yeah. And for people to be helped by something you did, I think that is just pleasurable. And so seeing, wow, look at all these stars, look at all these downloads, like, wow, I made something good, I think just actually does inherently feel pretty good too.
Yeah.
Now, I think overall, the amount of work that goes into the more popular things and the more complicated libraries, I suspect that eventually is not the inherent rewards and the status boosts are not enough anymore. And something kind of special is happening there, or maybe you're leaning really hard on the altruism part, or maybe even just inertia, where it's well, I started this and I feel like I kind of got to keep it going.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm kind of wow, that just kind of keeps working. Interesting.
Yeah, because I've mostly just released small things. Like even before I started releasing stuff from kind of SavvyCal, I had a Ruby gem that's probably now at least 10 years old that helps you do adding a sequence number onto a model. So think of the GitHub issues, how they're scoped to a project and then it starts at issue 1 and goes to issue 2 and it naturally counts up. So it's not a global primary key that you're seeing there. It's a scoped sequence number for a particular, particular scope. And so I had a use case for that 10 years ago. I can't even remember what project it was and released a gem for that. And it still is in use today. But I'm a terrible maintainer because I don't even work with Ruby anymore. But there's a few people from the Ruby community who have stepped up to help maintain it. And that's kind of gone up and down on activity, I guess. But yeah, it's it's fun to release something. I remember when I first released that and it got some uptake, it felt really good. But then at a certain point it comes down to all right, now it's I can either spend the weekend, hanging out with my wife, or I can hack on this project. And you can and a small library like this doesn't have a whole lot of issues and PRs being submitted on it. But if it was one where every week there's more issues, there's more effectively support tickets happening and more attempts to contribute, that's just, it's a lot of personal time you have to invest.
Yeah.
So I'm glad people do it.
Me
Please
too.
Don't stop.
Yes. Bless all of you. Mm-hmm. Quickly, or sort of briefly, at the top of the show, I introduced you as someone who is developed programming plus design chops. Recommendations for getting to an MVP of design capability as a more technical person?
I would say, so Adam Wathan and Steve Sugar have a book called Refactoring UI. And I think I still have a testimonial quote on it that's this is the resource I wish I had when I was getting started. And I stand by that. I think it's a really good primer that's because I think that's what developers need is something that's not too theoretical. That's not too art and design school, but it's functional. I think a lot of developers can become really good UI UX designers. It's a whole different beast to be a graphic designer or an illustrator or something like that. That feels like a whole different level of art, But I think being able to snap together user interfaces and kind of develop sensibilities about, how to place things and how to make things usable. We can all be a bit introspective about, encounters throughout our day where we interface with products. It doesn't even have to be necessarily software products; it could be physical products. The buttons on your washing machine or something, and you can just start to get a sense if you pay attention, like what makes sense about these things, what doesn't make sense about these things, what kind of abstractions translate. And I think a lot more people than they give themselves credit for can develop a proficiency for that. And I would say that's where my main strength is in user interface stuff, and primarily because I was just kind of a nerd about it. Like I grew up kind of looking closely at user interfaces and thinking like, you know what, I could do this. I think I know how to do this, and then just doing a bunch of it, So that's what I would say.
Cool. Awesome. Derrick Reimer, thanks for coming by the podcast. It's good to catch up again after so long.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
First almost AOP in a few years. It's a treat.
Yep. Feels good.
All right. Thanks for coming on.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Bye.